I have seen a very clear understanding of the practice or the tradition. And those, even from the south, if they don't understand the tradition, are the ones who immediately jump on the bandwagon of gender discrimination. Now, I will not get into let's say logic, I will not get into Shastra, I will not get into anything. So I will simply throw a couple of numbers at you. Assume for a moment that there are 500 temples dedicated to Dharmasastha and Ayyappa across the country, and there is only one temple which observes this particular restriction. Is that an example of discrimination or is that an example of diversity? Answer loudly. Diversity. You have to ask yourself, when the facts are so clear, why is it that this issue has been distorted to this extent? That this beautiful place, that this sacred temple has become the center of such an ugly controversy. It is not disconnected from the topic or the theme of my topic because it is ultimately a question of identity. I see the movement supporting the tradition of the Sabarimala temple as a movement of assertion of the indigenous identity, which is basically saying, stop looking at us from the lens of an outsider, stop looking at us from the lens of a Britisher, stop looking at us from a colonial lens. You don't understand us, therefore you do not reserve the right to judge us, is the basic point of this entire movement. Can you decide or pass a comment on something unless and until you understand it? Can you make a comment on physics or mathematics or even classical music or Carnatic music or dance form on its technicalities unless and until you're a student of that particular subject? Is it possible? Yes or no? Will you ever make the mistake of speaking on a subject that you're not aware of? Then how is it that so many of us have such fantastic opinions on this particular issue without knowing what the tradition is about? That is the fundamental question that you must ask yourselves. It is possible that most of us believe that this generation is vastly superior in its intellectual capacity to its ancestors. It is possible for us to believe that we know better than our fathers, our forefathers, our ancestors. And it is possible that we believe that we worship logic and reason much more than everybody else did because they were superstitious idiots. Assume for a moment that is the case. Then of all the people, the burden is on you to ensure that you never open your mouth on a subject unless and until you are informed of the facts. Yes or no? So the next time, even if you're not aware of the tradition or you're not aware of the facts, but somebody chooses to shoot from the hip or comment, and he's not in a position to back it up, do you have at least a semblance of duty to ask him what is the basis of his opinion or her opinion? I would say so. If we are comfortable making fun of our own traditions because we believe it's superstition, then the question is, do we have a problem with the tradition or do we have a problem with the question of superstition? If we have a problem with superstition, regardless of where it comes from, you must be in a position to question it. Yes or no? And regardless of the number of people who hold that particular opinion, because if you decide to raise questions only if the number of people on the opposite side is less, then that will make you a coward. Yes or no? If there are more people opposing you and you do not have the guts to raise the question, then clearly it's a position of convenience. Yes or no? So when the media constantly talks about this particular issue, honestly touch your hearts and tell me how many of you decided to voice your opinion on social media, asking what is the basis of the media's opinion. How many of you decided to use your platforms, your Twitter handles, your Facebook platforms, or WhatsApp groups, or all the favorite platforms for, they say, this particular generation, to ask them these fundamental, simple questions? Why? Because the issue does not affect you. It doesn't concern you. Had this been a campaign with respect to a non-dharmic institution or a non-Hindu institution, would some of us have not felt that this is unfair treatment to a minority religious institution? We would have. Yes or no? It's not wrong. If you see injustice happening to any institution, regardless of its faith, you have a right to question it. There's no doubting it at all. Whether it's minority or majority really doesn't make a difference. But you would have raised your voice, yes or no. But when it comes to your own institutions, there is a fundamental reluctance to stand up for it. Why? Is it because you're ashamed of your identity? Is it because you're ashamed of your history, your traditions? But how can you be ashamed of something if you don't understand it? Then neither should you be proud of it, nor should you should be ashamed of it. But why is your default setting that of being embarrassed? If you do not understand something, then the point is you must be undecided about it, correct? Then neither should you be pro or con, for or against. But the default setting seems to be always against in most places when it comes to our own traditions. That goes to the question of identity. The root of this particular issue is identity. The reason why I keep using this word like a stuck gramophone for the last half an hour is that as days go by and as time passes, you will realize that this particular word, this particular concept, this particular construct is going to be at the center of every national discourse. And there is not going to be a single issue that is going to affect your life which is devoid of its relationship to identity. If you have a position on reservation, assume for a moment that you have a position on reservation, can you divorce the question of reservation from that of a caste identity? You cannot. I am someone who supports reservations, by the way, for a very good reason. My reasons are different, but I do support them. The question is for how long will they last and who all must get it, but I certainly support caste-based reservations for a specific reason. But that's a discussion for another day. But the point I'm trying to make is this. When youngsters of your age, I'm 33, I don't know if there is any member of the audience who is a participant who is of my age. So I'll think of myself as someone who's at least a generation away from you, at the very least. When youngsters of your age choose to not take an interest on or in issues with respect to identity, it allows somebody to use you and make useful idiots out of you because you have a certain sense of activism, which is not necessarily supported by facts always, and that plays into the hands of people with a vested interest. You do not need to support anyone. But since you're such worshippers of logic and reason, and there has not been a single generation on earth which is as intelligent as you, and as smart as you, and as informed as you, I would certainly expect you to question every superstition and every position. And when you're presented with facts which you're not aware of, you must be in a position to change your position. Because if you don't do so, that would be the textbook definition of bias or prejudice. Yes or no? So here's my homework for you. Anyone who already thinks that he's aware of the Sabarimala issue, please go back and read it a bit more. And those who do not have possession of the facts of the issue, but certainly have fantastic opinions on the particular issue, the burden is on you to read further. Take that as a test case and ask yourself, is this an isolated instance or is this a pattern that is emerging? The exhortation that I am trying to make is this. I'm an engineer turned litigator. There is a reason I made that switch. Because I asked myself, what is it that I was going to do after engineering? I was a bloody good engineer, that much I'm sure of. I knew my subject. But the reason I made that switch was only this. Increasingly in my generation, there was a serious distance that was growing from our cultural central point, or cultural fulcrum, the center of gravity of our culture. And largely because there were not enough people who could articulate our position in a manner that is compatible with today's idiom. And therefore I decided to take it upon myself to try and attempt and make that particular change. There's a decent chance that I might fail. Or perhaps there's a 100% chance that I might fail, but nevertheless I've decided to take that particular opportunity. And I've said I'm taking that plunge. I come from a low middle class family, so it's not as if I had resources put on my table on a silver plate or a platinum plate telling me, "Bacche jo karna hai kar." That's not going to happen. I made that switch because I'm serious about it. What surprises me is those who see a value in justice, freedom, social justice, equality, don't see a value in history and identity. That is almost mind-boggling. How are you going to understand the concept of justice and freedom and free speech or any of these values that you wish to speak about or you're so passionate about unless and until you understand the journey? You don't need to form an opinion and then try and support the opinion with facts, but at least start having the facts and then arrive at a certain opinion. That is my humble request to this audience. Because if you have a certain opinion and you try and force fit all facts to conform to that opinion, it is dishonesty. Because you're not open to a different conclusion. But at the very least, have facts in your possession. Take an active interest. Can you change the fact regardless of which part of the world you go to that you're an Indian? Can you abandon that identity that you're of an Indian origin? Yes or no? So if somebody has a problem with that identity, even if you have chosen to abandon that identity, he will not stop or she will not stop. Why? Even when it comes to negative issues, we should have women first, is it not? So she will not stop unless and until you've been deprived of that identity. So if somebody has a problem with your identity, at the very least, they've identified that it is an important aspect of your personality. So if you can't realize what is your worth, your enemy is telling you what is your worth, or your adversary is telling you what is your worth. So as a lawyer, sometimes what happens is, when there are two arguments or two parties, sometimes you don't know which is the argument which he is going to start with, because you're not able to decide which argument is important. What we do then is that we wait for the first argument that is going to be made for the other side, from the other side. Because that tells us what, according to him, is our weakness or our strong point which he wants to dilute. Because that tells you what is the game plan. My request to you would be only this: become engineers, become doctors, become lawyers, do whatever you want. But do not ignore anything that affects who you are as a person, not as a professional. And according to me, and I'm backed by several philosophers and thinkers of this country, dharma and religion is the backbone of Indian identity. All culture has come and has flown from this particular Gangotri, and the Ganga which you see before you, which is culture, is the product of that Gangotri. I am not asking you to blindly follow anything. I am simply asking you to try and understand the concept of dharma wherever possible.